Okay, welcome and thank you for joining us in another of the Jane irrigation training sessions. And this week we're getting out of the box a little bit. We've talked a lot about irrigation, design, how to maintain it, how to put it together. And now we're going to talk about something that's really important to all of irrigation, and that's water. And more importantly, water reuse today, because without water, our irrigation industry, whether it be landscape, really is going to exist. And this is a big concern for all of us, right? What is going to the irrigation industry, in particular landscape, 10 years from now look like if we don't have a good, stable supply of watering plants, right? Because we know that when it comes to plants or people, or landscape and people, when I say people, I mean agricultural food for people, ag's always going to win out. And so that's the key. So what's happening now around the United States, around the world, to make sure we have adequate supplies for landscape as well. And so when we think about that subject and how important it is to what we're doing, we get a real expert today. And so we reached out to Bluefield Research, who's a global company that really focuses on technology and digital ways to manage water and observe water use. And they recommended we speak today with Erin, Bonney, Casey. And in speaking to her a couple times now, man, I really excited that she's presenting. You know, oftentimes, and there's a lot of water nerds and irrigation nerds on this presentation today, and we talk to people that have no idea where that comes from, costs, and not much knowledge about water. Well, we've got a real expert today. Erin's got a master's from Oxford in water science policy. She's been in this water world for several years now, and she comes from many different perspectives, not just ag water or landscape, but municipal water and water in general. So I'm really excited. Erin, thank you for joining us today. And you know, the first question I wanted to ask you, Erin, is I get a sense with everything happening with COVID that conservation when it comes to water might be dipping down a little bit. And I just wondered, you know, as a starter here, what you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think about it in two ways. One, I think water use we're going to see is going to be down overall this year because commercial and industrial facilities are shut down, especially like restaurants. So overall, I think we're going to see less water use. But when you're talking about conservation, like thinking about the kind of purposeful reduction in water use or improved water efficiency, I honestly think that people are just focused on other things right now. And especially when you're talking about individual consumers or use within the household, I think people are saying, you know what, I'm going to take an extra long shower, or I'm going to water my my garden that I'm spending all my time in now. There's this, I think there's a limit to the amount of kind of effort people can put into things. And there's so much effort going into other areas of our lives right now that I think the water conservation piece is probably on the back burner. And while I don't see it as a huge problem in the near term because we are seeing reduced water use in other areas, I do worry that it's going to kind of change the mindset. We as a water industry have been working so hard to get people to be more conscious about water use. And are we going to kind of shift a mindset where people are just not thinking about that as much going forward?
Yeah. So, well, it's good to hear that, number one, probably on the bigger scale, it's less, and that all the extra watering is not as big impact, but yeah, we have to stay on top of it, right? We don't want all the good work that we've all done for the past, how many years goes to waste. So anyway, well, listen, we're really excited to learn about water use and the options for recycled water for irrigation.
Great. So I'll start. I want to start out, I want to just talk a little bit about who is Bluefield Research, because I think that gives an important underpinning for kind of where we're coming from for those of you who might be unfamiliar with our research. So we are a market research firm. We're focused exclusively on the water and wastewater markets globally, both municipal and industrial, a little bit of irrigation as well, and especially where those municipal industrial irrigation uses and systems intersect. The primary way in which we serve clients is through our insight services, which provide ongoing support through company analysis, forecasts, access to our analysts to help companies plan their business strategy for the future. So in terms of reuse, we started tracking the reuse market about 5 years ago. And just earlier this year, we launched an insight service that's particularly focused on reuse. We have primarily been focused on municipal reuse, which is to say reuse of municipal reclaimed water for a whole host of applications. We've looked a little bit at industrial reuse, which we would define as reuse of industrial processed water on site. And then we've started looking at decentralized reuse as well, and I'll get more into what that looks like further in the presentation. And so all of that is just to say, I think our perspective on this market is really focused on business strategies as opposed to an engineering or a policy or regulatory focus.
Yeah. Okay, great. That helps us out a little bit to understand that. Thank you.
So just laying out quickly kind of the agenda for today. I want to talk about the history of kind of the water reuse sector, just ground us in where we've been, and then talk about where we're going. What does the future of the water reuse sector look like, especially as it pertains to water reuse for irrigation? Then I'll talk about decentralized reuse, which is kind of a new emerging method of reclaiming water within networks and presents a whole host of new market opportunities. And then I'll touch on the COVID-19 industry impacts in the water sector as a whole, and then reuse more specifically, looking at what do the shutdowns and the current economic environment mean for the water industry. And then we'll wrap up with any remaining questions we have. And I know people should feel free to kind of throw questions out as we go as well, and hopefully we can cover those throughout the presentation.
Yeah, good point. Thank you for bringing that up. You know, we've got the Q&A tab as well as the chat button on the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions, you can put them in either one of those. I'll be monitoring those and getting the questions to Erin where appropriate. So thanks, Erin. Great.
All right, so with that, I'll start with kind of where we've been. What's the reuse landscape look like to date? So here we're looking at the reuse market by state, and you can see that historically the reuse market has existed in 3 key states: California, Texas, and Florida. And those states, they kind of make sense because they're large, a lot of water use, and they tend to be water stressed. So in the case of California and Texas, you know, it's kind of absolute water stress in terms of scarcity and drought. And in Florida, it's has to do with their use of water, their intensity and with which they're using their water, and also some threats to the aquifers that they have historically relied on. We also see a number of what we call second-tier markets, states kind of moving towards more reuse. And then you can see in the pie chart on this chart, irrigation to date has made up the lion's share, the majority of the uses of reclaimed water, with potable and industrial kind of lagging behind it. And the reasons that irrigation has been so dominant in terms of where reclaimed water is going is, you know, there's a couple reasons I would say. One, the volume of water demand for irrigation. There's a clear need there, both when we're talking about agriculture and we're talking about landscaping. There's also the quality issue. Water for irrigation doesn't have to be as high a quality necessarily as potable quality water. So when you're talking about reclaimed water, there are potential cost savings by using less treated water for your irrigation purposes versus using water treated to potable standards and then using it for irrigation. And then I would say, whenever we talk about reuse, we also have to think about kind of public perception. And reuse for irrigation has a really long history. Therefore, the public tends to be fairly comfortable with it, especially in these leading states. People are aware that reclaimed water is used for irrigation. They see the purple pipes. And so there is an ease of expanding reclaimed water for irrigation because of that comfort level.
Yeah, so got a couple of questions here, Erin. One, big shout out for California, Texas, and Florida for leading this. What other states do you see that are, going to be coming along?
Yeah, I mean, so we see a lot of activity in the West, and you touched earlier on the drought emerging out there. We know that's a cyclical drought cycle. So every however many years, those states kind of revisit their water use strategies. So states that you would kind of typically think of as water scarce, like New Mexico and Arizona, they've been exploring reuse very heavily. Also, Colorado has been really working towards an integrated state water plan that includes reuse as kind of a portfolio approach. And then we also see, states that you might not think of as water scarce, but that are looking towards reuse to meet local water demand. So, Virginia or Oregon, Washington, states like that.
Yeah, and just so I want to get perfectly clear on this, reuse in this case means we're taking municipal wastewater, cleaning it and reusing it.
Yes, correct.
Okay, good, thanks.
Okay, so then looking at where we're going, what does the future of reuse for irrigation look like? So at Bluefield, when we're looking at the reuse market, we've built out this database of planned reuse projects. So right now we have 631 planned reuse projects around the country. And again, these are municipally planned projects or projects at the municipal scale. So you can see here, and it touches on what we were talking about before, California really dominates the planned project pipeline with almost half of the planned projects. You see Texas and Florida are coming in second and third. And then you start to get into these other states like Colorado or Washington or Arizona, Oklahoma, that are also exploring reuse. And what we see with reuse is California, Texas, and Florida, because they have so many projects already in the ground and history of reuse, there's a supportive regulatory environment and a supportive kind of history and case studies for them to draw on. So it accelerates the pipeline. So we're really excited when we see other newer states planning projects, because we know kind of one reuse project begets another in a couple of years as this becomes a part of the planning process within the state.
Yeah, so Erin, in these situations, right, it's better or more likely that water reuse or recycling water will happen in a new development versus going in and retrofitting established area. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, so especially when you're talking about reuse for irrigation, I mentioned that one of the advantages there is that you don't have to have the same quality water. Now, the disadvantage there is that you need two sets of pipes, because you have to bring your potable water to the development, and you also have to bring reclaimed water to the development. And because of that, it's a lot easier to institute reclaimed water systems in new developments where you're already putting new pipes in the ground, rather than trying to retrofit it and kind of piecemeal a purple pipe system within an existing city or development.
Yeah, so here in San Diego, the reclaimed water is less than half the price of municipal water. And so, I mean, that's right, because you do have to do some extra work to get the pipes there. But so I would think everybody would be fighting for reclaimed water in their areas. Is that the case? I mean, is there a battle there about where this goes, or is this something that has to be pushed along still?
Yeah, it's interesting because the pricing of reclaimed water, when you're talking about the city bringing it to end users, they're often pricing it lower as an incentive to get people excited about using it. And there's a whole host of reasons that a utility might want to push reclaimed water. It could be because they're facing scarcity and they don't have new supplies, so they're trying to make the most out of their current supplies. It could be that they don't want to discharge their wastewater because it's an environmentally sensitive environment into which they're discharging. So, I think that utilities are really playing around with the price of reclaimed water in order to kind of boost adoption. And to that end, it's not usually available to everyone. So they'll plan their pipe networks to serve certain areas and kind of offer it to the end users within that area.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
So just looking at a different cut of that same project data. So you can see here that irrigation still is the largest piece of the pie in terms of where those projects are planning to send water. We also see a big growth on the potable side. This slice, that's the gray slice that we've marked as unknown, we mark it as unknown because we haven't been able to find explicitly where they're going to send the water, but most of them are going to send it to irrigation as well. Because irrigation has been such a large market for us, it almost ends up as the default when you're planning a reclaimed water project. If you're planning a potable reuse project, then utilities tend to be pretty explicit about that. And I've touched on this a little bit in kind of what I've been saying, but just thinking about the drivers for reclaimed water, when you start to talk about using reclaimed water because it requires lower levels of treatment than potable water, we're using it for irrigation, and the cost savings associated with that treatment, you really are embracing a mentality of kind of fit for purpose water, that you don't have to use the same quality water for every application, and that there are different parameters that are important for water for irrigation versus drinking water versus industrial water. And so we see reclaimed water kind of taking off in municipalities and in states that are embracing this approach to think about what are the actual requirements for this water use, and how do we meet those requirements most cost effectively, rather than treating all of the water to potable standards and kind of over treating it in some cases.
That's great. We did have somebody make the comment, Erin, that in Hawaii, they're actually recycling to R1 reuse, and it's very expensive. However, they are selling it at a fraction of the cost to get people to recycle more. And so, I mean, that's in California is dominating the reuse pipeline, right? But other additional drivers for reuse in other states seems to be what you're talking about.
Yeah, Hawaii is a great example because on the one hand, they do have issues around water scarcity because they are an island state. They have limited supplies. They don't have the option to bring it in across the state lines. They also have a lot of drivers around environmental issues and reducing outflows into their in sensitive marine ecosystems. So there's kind of a dual push in Hawaii to both reduce the wastewater outflows and kind of secure supplies within the island as well. And so when you start talking about the economic calculation of reuse, well, are we putting a dollar amount on the environmental benefits of reclaiming that water as well?
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
So the next step in Bluefield's process when thinking about this as a market is we use that project pipeline to build out a forecast of capacity additions over the next 10 years. And basically, when we think about a forecast, the next, say, 2 to 3 years is heavily dependent on projects that are already kind of underway. Either they're already under construction or they're well advanced in the planning process, securing funding, putting the projects out to bid, things like that. Once you get a little bit further out, you start having to make more kind of assumptions about which way the market is headed based on projects that have been announced, and then also knowing that, in the latter half of the 2020s, there will be additional projects that will be implemented that haven't yet been announced or fully fleshed out. So with that, you can see that, let's see, there's about 7 million cubic meters per day of capacity additions over the next decade. And irrigation makes up about 49% of that when we're talking about municipal reuse again. So we're talking about that comes from a centralized wastewater treatment plant.
So that's great. That's a big number, right? And then as I look at graph, all the green is the irrigation, and it's each year, not a cumulative.
Yes, correct. So you do see a slight dip in from 2021 to 2024, and there are two reasons for that. One is we do see that within the project pipeline. So it's funny because when you talk about like landmark years like 2020 or 2030, everyone says they're going to get their project done by 2020, and then it kind of bleeds out. So you see these spikes in 2020, 2021. But the decline is also related to what we're seeing with the COVID shutdowns, which I can talk more about in a few slides, but projects are starting to be pushed out as people are figuring out what do their budgets look like and what does their construction activity look like over the next couple of years.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was thinking that, I mean, I was hoping, I guess, the eternal optimist, I would be thinking that green column going up each year over and over, but that's so true about the deadlines on the even decade numbers.
Yeah, and it is important to your point that they're additions each year. So the total amount of reclaimed water for irrigation goes up. It just depends by how much is it going up each year.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So decentralized reuse, talking about new market opportunities. So when we look at the municipal reclaimed water space, as I mentioned a couple times, we're thinking about water that comes from a centralized wastewater treatment plant and then goes out to end users of that reclaimed water, whether it be for irrigation or industrial users or for potable use. One emerging trend that we're seeing in this space is decentralized reuse, where we're talking about reuse kind of at the source. For various applications. So when we think about the potable addressable market for reclaimed water, this is data from the USGS, and it's looking at end users of the public water supply. So people connected to piped municipal water. And you can see here that there's kind of a whole range of end users. And when we're talking about decentralized systems, I want to really focus on the commercial and industrial facilities that have the opportunity to significantly reduce the water demand on the municipal systems. That reduction in water demand can be critical for utilities in water scarce areas that are looking to secure supplies for growing populations, and it also presents the opportunities for savings on water purchase costs at commercial and industrial facilities. We know that water rates around the country are continuing to rise faster than the cost of other goods, and so water represents an increasing cost for end users. And we know that commercial and industrial property owners are really driven by the bottom line. So does decentralized reclaimed water offer them a cost savings? And I know when we look at this, and we've been talking about reclaimed water for irrigation, you see that irrigation makes up a relatively small 1% of that total public water supply. And I just want to kind of drill into that commercial piece, because when you're talking about end users, a municipality is saying, well, this is a commercial end user, but within a commercial facility, there are all different types of water use. And you can see here, depending on the facility, landscaping and irrigation for landscaping can be a huge piece of the total water used within, educational facilities for playing fields, or the landscaping around office buildings, hotels, things of that nature. So we start thinking about decentralized reuse as using the water produced at these commercial and industrial facilities that goes down the drains, the toilets and the sink drains, and then using that water, treating it on site, and then reusing it for some kind of lower quality use, and that could be landscaping or cooling towers or washing equipment, things like that.
Yeah, so one of the most famous ones we all learned about when we were Big Thirst from Charles Fishman was Mission Linen in Las Vegas, right? This is what we're talking about. They use all their water as much as they can. They treat it on site and use it again in their cleaning process. This is, or I've done some projects in the past, interestingly enough, with two manufacturers and wastewater and used it for their irrigation on their landscape. This all counts as water reuse, even though it doesn't go through a municipal cleaning process or something the city is doing.
Yeah, and you know, we're increasingly seeing companies that are able to offer on-site treatment systems, some simple, some more complex, depending on the demand. And then included in those treatment systems are kind of long-term operations contracts. So to take the burden of operating reclaimed water systems, treatment systems off of the commercial property owner who doesn't necessarily want to be dealing with water quality issues. And then using that water kind of wisely on site to offset a lot of the potable water supply. And we know that in terms of volume, water for irrigation is a huge piece of it. And even though that might not be the quality, again, the quality demands are not there in the same way that you would need for potable, or even, you know, for industrial facilities that are going towards like into products like beverages, food and bev, and things like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it seems, you know, very unlimited as to what the opportunities are. You know, I saw a presentation about Australia and how they were using the sink wastewater to directly pipe it over to the water tunnels to help, you know, use the water to push the waste. And I thought, what a, you know, this is an idea that came out of necessity.
Yeah, and I mentioned before too that when you are talking about municipal systems and looking at kind of a larger ecosystem within a state, that one reuse project kind of begets another reuse project. And we see the same thing as we've seen decentralized reuse projects in isolation and in kind of limited case studies up until now, but we see them kind of picking up steam. And as you can get, you know, suppliers and operators to get kind of a critical mass of decentralized systems within a city or a region or a state, it gets easier to add more, right? Because the infrastructure is already in place for them to support their customers for on-site reuse.
Yeah, interesting, great, yeah, thank you.
And kind of to that end, one of the barriers that we've seen to date for decentralized reuse is this kind of complicated regulatory landscape. And it's complicated because the regulatory landscape hasn't really been written with this fit for purpose water economy in mind. So just, this is an example from Portland, Oregon. It would be applicable to many different cities and regions around the country, but when you're talking about drinking water in Portland, it's regulated by the Department of Health and Human Services. When you're talking about gray water, so once you turn on the sink and it goes down the drain, now it's regulated by the plumbing code. And then when you're talking about irrigation, it's regulated by the Department of Environmental Quality. And we know that if you're talking about a decentralized system, you're touching all pieces of that water value chain. And so it starts to get very, very complicated to know kind of what the regulatory requirements are. And we do see some change in some states talking about moving towards statewide regulations for non-potable on-site reuse, which is what we would be talking about with irrigation. So you can see kind of the range of states that are they either have non-potable reuse regulations in a few cases, or they're moving in that direction, or in the case of Texas and Alaska, expressed conceptual interest, kind of talking about it, but no concrete action yet. And then I have starred on here 2 cities, New York and San Francisco. And those cities get stars because they've actually actively decided to promote decentralized reuse systems for non-potable applications. And they're making money available to that end through loans and grants. And so those are really going to end up being kind of the test markets for a lot of these decentralized systems and technologies.
Yeah, so Erin, I know you're reporting on what's happening, right? And that's important. I'm interested in your opinion too. Is this going to save the water issues that we have in the U.S. or put a dent in it? What do you think here? How big of an impact is this actually going to have?
Yeah, I think So I think in terms of volume, we have a ways to go before this makes up a big piece of the pie in terms of the volume of reuse. But I think it represents an important shift in starting to think about very localized water use, like at within a development, or even in these cities within an individual building. Because right now the go-to model has been very centralized. All the water gets collected and goes to one wastewater treatment plant, and then from there you have to pipe it to all of the end users for reclaimed water, which can be expensive to put all of those pipes in the ground. So I do think it represents an important shift in thinking about kind of thinking more dynamically about how we manage water. And I will say the other shift that I think it represents too is, so utilities are typically set up where they get money for how much water they bill you. So they have an incentive in some ways to sell you a lot of water. It's the flip side is that they also have an incentive not to sell you less water, because if you're in a water scarce area. But the decentralized model in some ways cuts back on their revenue because they're selling less potable water now. But utilities are starting to look at these bigger picture issues like water availability, or thinking about the whole water cycle. They're able to partner with private commercial property owners to come up with a win-win scenario where the decentralized systems take some of the pressure off of strapped municipal systems, and also can offer cost savings for the private users, who are reducing the amount of water that they have to purchase from the utility, and also reducing the amount of wastewater that they discharge. So you get the savings on the sewer surcharge side as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I got to see this as a big positive for the cities, right? It eliminates their need to deal as much with all their runoff issues too. You know, what to do with that stormwater runoff.
Yeah, absolutely. And, San Francisco in particular, they have been facing the need to upgrade their wastewater treatment plant. And they have specifically said, well, if we got more people to use decentralized reuse, we wouldn't have to upgrade that plant. We would have the capacity to continue our growth. And so they've been able to kind of quantify how much money they're able to save in deferring and delaying that planned expansion.
I mean, that's really great for them. And, especially here in California, where everybody's building on a slope or a hill, this is better for the water, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's actually good for the industry as well, because if you can get the utilities, the municipalities, and the regulators pulling in the same direction as you, it just makes the whole process much easier. Great, so the last section of my slide deck here, COVID-19 impacts. So this is the question that I spend all day, every day answering right now, which is what's gonna happen now because everything is different. So when we start looking at this, the first exercise that we did is we looked at how does the water industry react to recessions. So we looked historically at the growth rate of capital expenditures during the last 4 recessions. And then the solid line here is the average of all the recessions. So what you can see is typically the water industry, the good news is that the water industry tends to be less impacted than other industries during a recession. It's a little bit more recession proof. The impacts tend to be delayed by a couple of years from the official start of the recession. And that really reflects planning cycles when you're talking about larger scale water projects. The projects that are already in development and moving forward tend to continue to move forward. So you don't see the impacts to the industry until year 3, roughly. And then you can see, and then the industry starts to recover in the latter half of this 8-year period that we've outlined here. So taking that into account, we did this forecasting exercise for the entire water industry We actually did it last fall. So we put out this maintaining status quo scenario. Everything was looking pretty good. We also were addressing, well, what would happen if we hit a recession? And the reason that we forecasted that last fall, to be honest, was it just felt like we were like year 10 of a bull run, and we know that the economy is cyclical. And so customers are starting to say, well, it just feels like at some point we're going to face a downturn. So the darker gray line that you see on this slide is basically us modeling, well, okay, well, if a typical recession hit in 2020, how would that impact the forecast? And so that's kind of what the average recession looks like. You can see that delay in, you don't really feel the effects until 2023, 2024, and then kind of decline steeply, and then like a less steep recovery, more gradual recovery. The COVID-19 scenario looks a little bit different because we see the impacts happening more abruptly because of the hugely like the huge and severe impacts on utility budgets, and immediate impacts, I should say, that we're going to see with the lost revenue from water sales and the moratorium on shutoffs, and then of course the unemployment. The rate at which the unemployment numbers have fallen during this recession kind of indicates that it's going to hit faster.
Yeah, so it's interesting that it does seem that the biggest hit maybe comes 3 or 4, or even on the other side, as many as six years after.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I will say is when we did these scenarios, we were kind of thinking about what would be the worst case scenario. And so we eliminated any impact on potential stimulus spending. In the last recession, stimulus spending really kind of changed the outlook for the water industry because they got a big infusion of cash through the state revolving funds. So municipalities especially were able to keep going, and it pushed the impacts of the recession out a little bit. So we're continuing to pay attention to that. I don't see anything really happening until 2021 in terms of a big infrastructure stimulus bill, for political reasons primarily. But that could, that could definitely improve the outlook for the water industry.
Right, because we hear a lot, or have heard a lot, about the infrastructure, the leaky pipes, how much was wasted. I've also heard ridiculously low numbers to actually repair that. What's your opinion on all this? Is it as big a problem as many people think it is, and can it be solved relatively easily? Yeah,
I mean, it is a huge problem, and the solution is really simple. You just need more money. I think it's a sector that, in a typical recession, when you're talking about just injecting cash into the economy to try and get construction and employment up and things like that, the water sector is a perfect opportunity for that because there is a demonstrated need, and it's critical infrastructure, right? So who's going to argue with upgrading and repairing the water infrastructure? Reuse has historically been seen as a little bit more of kind of optional spend because, and so if your budget comes under strain, can you push your reuse out into the future? But what we've really seen, especially in California in the last drought, is that it can be one of the most cost-effective ways to expand your water supply, especially when your alternatives are bringing it in from far away or desalination, which in most communities is really not an option for a number of regions. So reuse is starting to be seen as more of an integral part of a diversified water supply portfolio, and therefore kind of less likely to be on the chopping block when you're facing budget cuts.
Yeah. All right. Interesting. Thank you.
And then see if this works. There we go. So the other piece that I would just talk about the impact of COVID on wastewater reuse is I mentioned briefly that public perception and public acceptance of wastewater reuse is critical for a lot of these projects. And right now, the discussion around COVID and wastewater is how you can test for community spread within your wastewater systems. And it is establishing this link between COVID-19 in your wastewater. And my concern would be that even though the discussion right now is not around health risks and exposure to wastewater, there still is this link in people's minds that there are viruses within the wastewater. And is that an additional barrier to some of these reclaimed water projects going forward? Do you have to kind of re-educate the public or reassure the public after this that reclaimed water is safe?
Yeah, this is right. The whole yuck factor. This is. I'm glad you brought it up. I'm glad we didn't skirt it, and but I think that we're actually getting beyond it, and people are actually looking at the science of what's happening and saying, yeah, you can clean it, you can make it safe, and it really is okay.
Yeah, I definitely, I don't think the yuck factor is an insurmountable obstacle. I think it's just one that people need to be conscious of as they're planning these projects, and really being clear and communicating with end users and the public about, the risk factors and the safety factors within these systems.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, thank you.
And that brings us to my very last slide, which is the key takeaway slide. So I'll just run through really quickly. So we see the reuse market continuing to grow. They're expected to add, 8.2 million cubic meters per day in reuse capacity between 2020 and 2030. Irrigation will be the largest opportunity for reclaimed water, 49% of those capacity additions. Finding suitable off-takers remains a challenge. So one of the reasons that reuse for irrigation is slowing is that you still need to identify economical off-takers, and usually that's high volume users. So we see an expansion in reclaimed water for irrigation at parks and even agriculture in urban areas, golf courses, things like that, where it's potentially higher contact, but much higher volumes of water as well. Decentralized reuse is a new model to expand reuse applications and potentially offers savings on reducing the amount of purple pipe systems that you have to put in place if you can reclaim water on site for use within irrigation. And then finally, the COVID-19 impacts will be a near-term obstacle, but in the longer term, I think the reuse industry is going to continue to grow despite those negative pressures.
Yeah, so we had an interesting comment here, right? And the person says, most users love reuse, but the departments and developments don't like it. And it's a suggestion that the marketers may be wrong, and I sure hope so. I sure think that, and I sure hope so.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So we have one last question from the audience that I want to ask right now, and that is, and we hear it all the time, we get it all the time, and it's important for people to understand, and that is, I keep saving water, but the price keeps on going up. And so people don't understand that. So maybe you can clear this up or help people understand why that happens and why it's so important to save, and how, the saving causes it not to go up so much.
Yeah, so when water utilities set their rates, they basically do a calculation. They are trying to cover their costs by the amount of revenue that they collect through those water and sewer surcharges. And the amount of money that a water utility needs to operate is somewhat independent from the amount of water that they actually need to send through the system. And that's because water utilities have a huge amount of infrastructure that needs to be maintained regardless of the amount of water that you're sending through the pipes. So the whole pipe network, the treatment plant, all of those things, the cost of operating them is really independent of the amount of water that end users are using. You get some small savings on the treatment side, like you need less chemicals for treatment and things like that if you can reduce the volume. But typically, the costs are the same. And so as the volume of water that individuals are using goes down, the amount that you have to charge per volume of water has to go up to cover those costs. One of the reasons that I would say it's still important to conserve is because, especially within our cities, the intensity of water use is going up. And so water utilities are having to, if they have to expand their supplies, you're looking at much more expensive options. And I think the easiest way to think about this is we have tapped our cheapest options first because we're extremely logical, and anything that you're going to add on top of that from where we are now is going to be more expensive. So you're either going to be pulling water in from further away, or you're going to have to be desalinating water, which is really expensive. So when we talk about conservation, it's a way to kind of keep the water supplies manageable as the population grows and the water use in certain areas becomes kind of more intense.
Yeah, well, that's a great explanation. I think that'll help all of us understand that a little bit better. So thank you.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, that kind of wraps up my presentation. I want to thank you very much for having me today. It's been really, really interesting.
You did a really good job, and again, made this subject of water really interesting and fascinating, how you always do. But we did have one last question that just came in, and it said, is it good to reuse water during COVID? There's a concern that the virus will be washed into the water, and the expense of cleaning that to make it, is going to be higher. Is that an issue?
So I'll just say I'm not like an epidemiologist. So what I've seen, the COVID does not seem to be waterborne. So I don't think that there's currently a concern that COVID presence within the water presents a public health risk. I think when they're talking about finding trace amounts, that's virus that has already been shed and it's not active anymore. So yeah, I mean, in terms of COVID, I don't think that's on people's radars. I think it is for the industry more broadly. We do have to pay attention to emerging viruses and be aware of what is in the water and what we're treating for before we reuse it. But that is also true for any water supply, because ultimately everyone is reusing water that's been somewhere else before, whether you're talking about in a reservoir or in a stream or even in the ground. So.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then I see your email address up here. Is that right? Can people reach out to you and if they have additional questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I would be more than happy to answer any questions about this presentation or other research we've done, or Bluefield in general, or anything. We're always available.
Yeah. Well, great. Again, thank you so much for coming on and helping us out today. Thanks to everybody who was watching. Don't forget, you can see all our trainings on our website. Just search irrigation training on the Janes USA website, and also remember that we're on Apple, Google, and Spotify podcasts now. So great way to listen to these presentations. You're driving job to job work or walking and running like many of us do now that we're safe at home. So again, thanks very much. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks again, Erin.
Thanks.